Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project podcast. My name is Patrick Cummings. As always, I'm here with E.C. Sinkowski. Every week on the show, we aim to simplify the science of nutrition, health, and fitness, cutting through the noise to focus on the principles and practices that will help you perform better, feel better, and, of course, live better. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. Hello, E.C. How are you?
Good. What's up with you?
Oh, enjoying the summer. This week, we are going to talk about an article from the New York Times. The title, I think this came out a little while ago, but it's titled 10 Nutrition Myths Experts Wish Would Die, where the paper surveyed some of the, and this is a quote, some of the country's leading authorities to reveal the truth about fat, dairy, soy, and more. Were you one of the experts, EC? Did they survey you?
I was not.
Oh, come on now, New York Times, you're missing out. Okay, so very simply, we're going to break down each of the myths, and you're going to tell us what you think, and if you agree that these are, in fact, the 10 nutrition myths that you wish would die. Cool?
Let's do it.
Super simple. Jump right into myth number one, which is fresh fruit and vegetables are always healthier than canned, frozen, or dried varieties.
That is correct. That it's a myth. And
do that for everyone. You'll just say, correct, that is a myth, and then we'll move on. It'll be the shortest episode we've ever done.
Shortest podcast out there. Yeah, and I'm actually really glad they let off with this one. I mean, probably no surprise, a la 800-gram challenge, but I just love it. We need people eating more fruits and vegetables, period. We don't need to know which fruits and vegetables they are, and we certainly don't need to worry if they're cooked, canned, frozen, or fresh. You know, we talked about this a bit ago. I think it was like the minimalist episode. But canned and frozen fruits and veggies have at least the comparable nutrition to fresh, if not better in some cases, because generally with storage, the amount of nutrients decrease. And so fresh is not always better because there's going to be transit times for those. And there's also going to be the time that you have it just sitting in your refrigerator waiting to eat it. And so this is why sometimes the frozen or even the canned, they're picked when they're at their peak of freshness, and then they're sort of preserved in that state. Now, they're not perfectly preserved forever, but there's going to be some different rates of losses. It's really impossible to make very blanket statements to say that frozen is always better and fresh is always better because of some of those different transit times and variables, but there's also just differences in the vitamins and the minerals and the phytochemical compounds that we've talked about their rate of decline, which is based on what their chemical structure is and how they withstand temperature and light and all this stuff. So the point is no one form is always better, and surprise, surprise, there's lots of different factors that will come into play in terms of the nutrition within it. But what we find is that they're at least comparable not to sort of do these different choices of, I always need fresh or something like that. And I think the other thing that I like to bring up and remind people about, because people forget about this, is the actual vitamins and minerals and phytochemicals in your fruits and vegetables differ based on the environment they grew in. Like we talked about this on the most recent organic podcast, but literally the variety of the crop you have, there's lots of different types of tomatoes. Which type of tomato are we talking about? What type of soil was it grown in? What were the agricultural practices? Did they use a cover crop or not? What was the environment like? The weather, the atmosphere, all can affect the vitamins, minerals, phytochemicals that are in the crop. And so there's so much variation in this stuff that it is possible you have a canned vegetable that has better nutrient composition than a fresh, depending on all of that context. And we have to remember that, I think sometimes people get really worried about that because it means that we have so much variability in the data, but you also sort of just take some comfort in that. There's no logistical way that you're going to measure everything that goes into your mouth, except for maybe, who was that? That millionaire who's billionaire who's doing all of the crazy
Brian
research
Johnson.
On himself, right?
Brian Johnson.
But realistically, we're not going to measure everything that goes into our mouth before we do it to truly understand if our carrot this week is better than last week's carrot or something like that. So there's going to be some variation in the diet. We don't need to worry about that. We need to make sure we have lots of whole foods in our diet. We don't need to worry about cooked or fresh or whatever. And by having that nice baseline, we're going to hit the nutrient endpoints that we need.
One follow-up question. One thing we've talked about before is and you have actually experienced doing this. If you touch the product coming off of the farm, it's processed to a degree, right? Once a human touch, it's processed. And of course, processed food equal bad. Is that sort of where the confusion has gotten when it comes to frozen or canned or anything like that? That people assume if it's there, it must be processed, and I'm trying to eat fruit and vegetables, and that's the opposite of processed, and so that's why fresh must be better. Or is there some other reason that people have started to believe that anything other than fresh is bad?
I think that could be some of it. I also think we do have to be, and the New York Times actually said this, which I liked. We do have to be wary of, oftentimes canned is canned in syrup, and oftentimes frozen has other kind of seasonings. Even something like the pre-cut French fries has sugar on them already. So I think sometimes there can be the processing in the sense of we're just going to cut up the broccoli and stick it in the bag, and that's way different than we're going to soak all of these things in syrup like canned peaches or something like that. So I think some of that comes with it, as well as the idea, well, these things are just sitting around for a while, so they must be degrading. And it's like, well, the rates of degradation are going to vary. And so I think those are probably the two issues that have kind of come into play.
That makes sense. Okay, myth number 2. All fat is bad.
Correct. This is a myth. I always feel like I have to say that when you say like a myth is correct, what are we actually saying? Yes. All fat is not bad. Okay. But I sort of felt like this myth has died already. I mean, at least in the internet bubble that I find us in a lot, they do go on in kind of their explanation of this myth to explain that it's really more of the saturated fat and the trans fat that we have to watch out for, which, by the way, trans fat was effectively banned in our food supply, but it does still exist in small amounts. It tends to be more present in fast food where oil gets used and used over and over again. But generally, they're pointing out, hey, we got to be wary of the saturated fat and the trans fat, and that you want to increase your relative amounts of monounsaturated fat and polyunsaturated fat. And they kind of go through this, good fats versus bad fats idea. I think given the internet bubble or sphere that we live in, I would have probably written this myth as saturated fat is good for you, or something like you don't have to worry about saturated fat. I think in our group, we have more of the trending carnivore, animal-based, super low-carb approaches that really push this narrative that any amount of saturated fat is fine, when in reality, some amount of saturated fat is fine, and most of us need to lower it, as we've talked about before. I do like, though, in this piece, they talk about when people went low fat with manufacturing of their food, that the manufacturers ultimately, reduced the fat, but ultimately increased the sugar to make the thing still palatable. And so this is why we have to be wary of these labels like low fat, low sugar, whatever it is, because the manufacturer often finds a way to make up the total calories such that when you look at calories, not much has changed. They've just sort of been mucking around with these different macronutrients, right? So overall, I like what they wrote. I just think that it's less about just generally low fat that's the problem right now, and more that people are really pushing a saturated fat is good angle, which I disagree with.
Got it. All right. Myth number 3. Calories in, calories out is the most important factor for long-term weight gain. So they call this a myth. And they go on to say that you will probably gain weight if you eat more calories than you burn, which is good. But then they really say that it's the types of foods we consume, the ultra-processed stuff, the refined stuff. And the reason they give that those ultra-processed stuff is so problematic is that the nutrients flood the bloodstream and they get converted to fat in the liver. Like, it's hard for me to totally agree with this. Like, I do agree that we become overweight because of the ultra-processed foods. I mean, this is why obesity wasn't an epidemic 100 years ago. This is why I talk about why the environment's so important. But I think this implies that, if I have any level of these ultra-processed foods, a chip, a cookie, poof, my liver is, just now converting everything to fat. And so again, it misses that overall concept we talk about all the time of dose. I also agree with them here that I think just counting calories isn't the most effective strategy to lose weight. Hence, that's not the approach I use in my masterclass. So I understand why they could say this as well, like just having people only focus on calories and not filling up those calories with whole unprocessed foods is a less effective strategy. Like, I hear that, but at the end of the day, I wouldn't want somebody being like, calories is irrelevant. And I do see that a lot in the space where it's just sort of like, calories don't matter. It's like, they're part of the overall picture. They're certainly the main driver, and then we have to understand the context of those calories. So it's hard to say on this one. It's like, I don't agree that it's a myth, but I understand that there's more to diet success than calories in, calories out. So this is a sort of for me. Okay, myth number 4. People with type 2 diabetes shouldn't eat fruit. Oh, well, I already know. I already know what you're going to say about this.
You already know what you're going to say about this. Now, I'm actually surprised they worded this way. Instead of sort of saying a myth like fruit has too much sugar, which is what I expected, they actually went just right into type 2 diabetes shouldn't eat fruit, which to me was kind of surprising for a mainstream article. But heck, I'm good with this. Now, they say this myth exists because people are confusing fruit juices, which can raise our blood sugar too quickly and too much, where fruit is lower in that amount of sugar and has fiber to slow down that raising the blood sugar. And that is all true, but I actually think that people aren't just confused about fruit juices versus fruit. I think people are still actually genuinely concerned and confused about fruit itself, at least in our community. Like, I have legitimately people, they wrote off fruit juice, I don't know, a decade ago, but they're still worried about the banana or the pineapple, right? So I think there's some true confusion just about fruit. Now, to improve insulin sensitivity, because type 2 diabetes means you're insulin resistant, so to reverse that, the person has to reduce the total quantity, total calories in the diet, which are coming from protein, carb, and fat. Now, for all intents and purposes, we know that no one is really overeating protein. So when we talk about reducing quantity in the diet, for 99.9% of people, we're talking about reducing carbs and fat in the diet. And notice I said carbs and fat. I didn't just say carbs. Fat plays a role in insulin resistance, and this is perpetually overlooked in the mainstream media. And this is why the American Diabetes Association does not recommend only low-carb diets. They recommend a quantity-controlled diet. And so I bring all of that up because I agree that people will focus on just this insulin spiking, and they don't look at the rest of the diet, something that we've heard before. Now, I do want to be really clear, especially if people, have type 2 diabetes. Of course, they need to be working with their doctor and a nutritionist on their specific goals and stuff like that and their intake. But just from understanding this quantity point of view, if somebody is insulin resistant and they take their normal diet and they keep eating that normal diet, and then they add a lot of fruit on top of that, they have increased their total quantity and likely worsened their insulin resistance. So there could be a scenario where somebody adds fruit to their diet and has that check the box mentality of, well, I just ate something healthy today. Now I can go on to have whatever else I want, the chips, the cookies, and whatever. And they have not improved their insulin resistance despite the fact they've increased their fruit consumption. That's generally not as common of an outcome because generally when people eat the fruit, they feel full. It cuts out all of their stuff. But I just want to put this in context for people that, like, you can't just keep eating the same quantity and add fruit on top and blame the fruit. Like, the fruit has to displace some of the quantity to make some of the improvements in the insulin resistance.
Got it. Myth number 5, plant milk is healthier than dairy milk.
Yeah, this one was an interesting one to bring up. I was like, wow, I didn't know this was a big myth. But it is correct that it is a myth. What's interesting to me, I was thinking about this, like the whole nut milk, alternative milks really exploded, I think, with the paleo diet craze, right? Like we can't have dairy, so now we need to source everything from almonds, which starts to be really interesting to me because I would argue that a lot of these nut milks, especially on a broad scale in the supermarket, are way more processed than dairy milk, right? Like if you flip over your almond milk from off the shelf, lots more ingredients and additives than milk, which is literally just milk. So it's kind of funny from this paleo point of view of like, we're going back to our ancestry and things aren't processed. And now I am doing a really processed, method to drink milk from almonds. Now, all of that aside, like I'm not against nut milks merely because they're processed. I just think that irony is really interesting. But it is true. These nut milks do have less nutritional value than dairy. Cow's milk has more protein than nut milks, and it has more vitamins and minerals like B12 and calcium in many cases. And a lot of the nut milks, for them to be more healthy, they actually fortify them, meaning they add vitamins and minerals to them so that they are more nutritious than what they would be just milked. I don't know what to say, just right after getting the milk from the almonds. Because a lot of the nut milks, they're just very low in calories. They're almost like a vitamin water because they've added these vitamins and minerals to them and they're pretty low in calories, especially for something like almond milk. Soy is a bit of an exception. That has a little bit more protein, also has some vitamins and minerals, a little bit more like cow's milk. But I agree that plant milk, we kind of all are just like so afraid of dairy. When we look at studies, we tend to find that health risk decreases with more dairy. And so I don't think that we need to be so obsessed with all of these alternative milks. And if you do believe that dairy is so inflammatory, we have a whole podcast on that. And so check out the show notes for that.
I'm glad I'm no longer in the phase of life where I'm looking at nut milks in the grocery store.
Which one? Hazelnut?
Right? Exactly.
Almond? Cashew? Hey, look, and if you love them, great. But yeah. I do agree. It's like you can also just drink milk if you like it. It's right. Okay.
Yes. Myth number 6, white potatoes are bad for you.
Preach,
Yes.
Gosh, go New York Times. Just love this one. I agree. This is a myth. Now, they go on to say that people fear them because it can spike your blood sugar. And then they also explain that they are quite healthy. They're rich in vitamins like C, and they also have fiber and all these other nutrients, which is great. And I also love that they brought up that, hey, white potatoes are really inexpensive. And so they're very accessible for people. And it's very true. But one of the things that people push back all the time is like the cost of all the fruits and veggies, right? It's like, well, enjoy the white potatoes. They're really healthy. And I do like to remind people that the 800-gram challenge allows them so long as they aren't commercially fried. So, keep that up. Potatoes are really satisfying, really healthy, all of that stuff. Now, I do wish, nitpicking here a little bit, they tackled that blood sugar spike thing a little bit more. They just sort of said, oh, people are fearful of them because they spike the blood sugar, but then go on to talk about how nutritious they are. But I do think that myth is so pervasive. Of course, we've talked about quite a bunch here on that podcast, and we'll link to that continuous glucose monitor episode in the show notes. But for newer listeners, if you're here, if you are worried about blood sugar spikes, what you're missing is you're missing the context of the whole diet. And I think a simple test, like think about Thanksgiving dinner. If you've had Thanksgiving dinner and you still have a healthy fasting glucose, it's because the whole context of your diet across weeks and months is such that you're not spiking your blood sugar too much and above and beyond your needs. And so this is the danger of just looking at foods individually. We have to instead look across that whole context. And I think once you start that kind of picture, you understand, okay, great, I need to look at foods more from a holistic point of view than individual, and I will include potatoes in my diet.
Team potato.
Team potato.
All right.
Potato sympathizer.
Myth number 7 of 10. You should never feed peanut products to your children within their first few years of life.
Okay, a little left field for us.
Yeah.
Typically not a topic that we dive into a lot here. I do agree it's a myth. Peanut allergy is a really big thing for kids, and early exposure, especially when they're ready for solid foods, which is around 6 months. So I'm not talking about day one early exposure, but 6 months exposure, it's typically good for kids to be exposed to a lot of food when you're starting to introduce solid foods, including peanuts, because it will actually help prevent allergies and sensitivities. Like to make kind of that first year of solid foods really diverse is actually a beneficial thing, because what you're doing is you're developing tolerance of the immune system. So tolerance is you want your immune system to not react to what would be considered normal foods. Like you do not want your system to react to peanuts, and you do not want it to react to wheat. And so early exposure tends to help with that. I mean, I think it's one of the things that I try to compare it to is they find that, people who live with dogs or on a farm tend to have more robust immune systems, and it's because they're more exposed to things that could potentially be problematic. And so it's the same idea with our foods, that you want to have this early exposure to train the immune system, so to speak, to be more robust.
Right on to myth number 8. The protein in plants is incomplete.
Yeah, we're not going to talk about this one too much. I think we've hammered this one. But yeah, this is a myth. So when we're talking about the composition of different proteins, we talk about the amino acids. They're really how the proteins are put together in terms of building blocks. There's 20 of them. 9 are considered essential meaning we must obtain them from the diet. And animal sources are typically classified as complete because they contain all of those 9 essential amino acids. Now, here's the second caveat. They also contain all 9 amino acids in amounts that are necessary for growth and development. And so oftentimes plant proteins are complete in the sense they contain all 9, but they don't contain enough of them. And so that's what this myth is really combating. The other thing that this myth is really combating is you have to remember that for anyone in the US, maybe not, subsistence farmers in other countries, but anyone in the US, even if they're a plant-based diet, they're not going to get all of their protein from just bread or just rice. And so maybe these plant proteins don't have as much as dairy or beef of these amino acids, but by the time you get enough protein from different foods across the diet, they add together to enough. And so this is why if you're vegan or vegetarian, you mix your sources, you get enough total protein, and you're just fine in terms of the essential amino acids you need.
2 more. Myth number 9. Eating soy-based foods can increase the risk of breast cancer.
Yeah, we're going to almost breeze past this one because we just did that kind of recent podcast on anti-nutrients, and phytoestrogens were one of them. Phytoestrogens are these estrogen-like compounds that are found in soy foods. And what we actually find, just very briefly, the short of it is that when you eat more of the minimally processed soy whole foods, tofu, edamame, even plain soy milk, that this actually decreases your risk of breast cancer and decreases your risk of breast cancer reoccurrence. And so people should be encouraged to eat more soy foods as part of their mixed whole food diet. And I'm glad they brought this up because this one is still a pretty common myth.
Last one, myth number 10. Fundamental nutrition advice keeps changing a lot.
I love this. And I actually wanted to directly quote the doctor that they quote. It's a Dr. Marion Nessel of New York University. And she said, quote, "In the 1950s, the first dietary recommendations for prevention of obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and the like advised balancing calories and minimizing foods high in saturated fat, salt, and sugar. The current U.S. dietary guidelines urge the same." And then continuing, "That advice worked 70 years ago and it still does today, and it leaves plenty of room for eating foods you love," end quote. And I just like totally 100% love this. I try to preach this all the time. You know, what we know about nutrition is not particularly sexy or interesting. And that's why there's so many really popular yet incorrect accounts on social media. They get really big because they're interesting in quotes, but it's really just that they're more entertaining, right? They don't actually give us the information that we need. The information that we need has been the same for tens of decades. Go look at the USDA count, look at the number of followers, go follow your favorite influencer. You're going to see that the USDA is not doing so well on social media because, you know, we're preaching the choir here. Fruits and veggies aren't particularly interesting. It's much more interesting to think about, oh gosh, everything's killing me, or that I really need to only eat pomegranates, or I don't know what it is right now. But I think there is this media narrative that everything's always changing in nutrition. Just another reminder, like, don't get stuck into the headlines. Don't get caught into these, you know, fear-mongering tactics of relative risk. I think we could legitimately stop producing any content around nutrition today, and we would have plenty of accurate and useful information for people to achieve their weight, health, and fitness goals. Like, we don't need any more nutritional education content about nutrition. It's out there. It's known. You just have to kind of push aside the noise and find people that are kind of preaching the basics. I think what is changing is maybe our understanding of why all these things work on the physiology level, but how to implement that and what you need to do is not changing. This is not a fast-moving field in terms of basic nutrition recommendations.
Yeah, one thing I've told people before is that I think naturally we're novelty-seeking creatures. We're looking for new, for various reasons, but nutrition is one of the places where novelty doesn't serve you. And so seek novelty, sure, but just elsewhere, just not in your diet, not in your nutrition. Find it somewhere else. There's plenty of other places you could seek novelty, just not in this one.
Pick up a new hobby.
That's right. Yeah. Okay. You seem pretty positive about this list, which doesn't surprise me at all, but I always like when we can be positive. Overall score, what would you kind of give to the New York Times for this list?
Yeah, I mean, I think originally I was thinking B+. I think, I don't know, maybe it's a Friday we're recording this. Maybe I'm in a good mood. Maybe I'll go A-. I mean, the calories
well-caffeinated,
well-caffeinated. The calories one kind of rubs me a little bit the wrong way because I can't take more people being like, calories don't matter. But I think they did pretty good. And you know, a couple wordsmithing on them. But I think they did overall really well, especially relative to a lot of online content, a lot of mainstream online content. So yeah, let's go B+, A-.
Take it. If you were one of the experts that they reached out to, as I dropped my pen, as they were putting this list together, what would you have added? What would you have advocated for? What would you have argued against?
Yeah, I think it's going to be just a little bit more skewed towards some of the trends in CrossFit community, functional fitness community, kind of performance related a little bit, especially hydration and electrolytes. I mean, but we've covered that one a ton. I think a little bit more, like I mentioned, when we were talking about fat, it would be a little bit more animal-based, carnivore, saturated fat slanted. I do think something about kind of low carb and or fasting for performance would need to be in there. Of course, all of these topics we've talked about before, so we'll put the links in the podcast, but it would definitely have a little bit more of that, you know, fitness angle to it on some of these than necessarily, let's say, you know, like the allergy one or something like that.
Take it. All right. Thank you, EC. Thank you, everybody out there, for listening. Thank you for sharing the show with your friends and your gym buddies. Thank you for your ratings and your reviews. EC and I will be back for a brand new episode of The Consistency Project next week.